My name is Rebecca Heald, and I'm the Curator of Adult Programmes here at Tate Britain, and I want to welcome you all here tonight for this very special event, the fourth in the series of Contested Territories, organised in collaboration with Chelsea School of Art and Design, and a special mention to Naked Punch Review for helping to bring this unique occasion together. As you can well imagine, we are delighted to have with us tonight's three speakers, Arthur Danto, Thierry Dedouve, and Richard Schusterman. Notably, there will be nobody chairing tonight's discussion. The three speakers have been in contact with each other prior to the event and decided to give their presentations in order of seniority. First, Professor Danto, then Professor Dedouve, then Professor Schusterman, so as to acknowledge Danto's interiority in dealing with the issues that concern them and the need to situate the issues in relation to Danto's groundbreaking work. So in terms of format, each speaker will give a short presentation of approximately 10 minutes. They will then join together in conversation, and there will then be an opportunity for you in the audience to ask questions. While tonight's speakers require no real introduction, I shall give some brief biographical details by way of suggestion as to why we have brought them together here tonight. Arthur Danto is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Columbia University, and since the publication of his essay, The Art World, in 1964, he has consistently proven himself one of the most important philosophers of art of the past 50 years. He is perhaps best known for his contemporary version of Hegel's End of Art thesis, first enunciated in 1984 and later developed in his book After the End of Art in 1997. He has, of course, authored numerous other key volumes, including The Transfiguration of Commonplace and The Philosophical Disenfranchisement of Art. Thierry Dedouve is an historian and theorist of contemporary art, committed to a reinterpretation of modernism. He is a professor of the University of Lille-Troyes. His work has long revolved around Marcel Duchamp's ready-made and its implications for aesthetics, and he is now finding a new centre of interest in the work of Manet. Dedouve is the author of several books, including the celebrated Kant After Duchamp. He is currently involved in a thorough reworking of his aesthetic theory. Richard Schusterman is Dorothy F. Schmidt Eminent Scholar Chair in the Humanities and Professor of Philosophy at Florida Atlantic University. Over the years, his work has challenged elitist aesthetics, defending the richness of popular culture and the cruciality of aesthetic experience. His books include Pragmatist Aesthetics, Living Beauty, Rethinking Art, and Surface and Depth, Dialectics of Criticism and Culture, as well as the provocative essay, The End of Aesthetic Experience. Today, together, they will consider the current interaction between art history and aesthetics. I'd like to thank our three very distinguished speakers for being here, but before we get fully started, I'd like to remind you to turn off your mobile phones. I'd also like to remind you that tonight's event is being webcast, so when we come to the end of the talk, if you wish to ask a question, please make sure you wait until you have the microphone for the benefit not only of the audience here, but also the audience online. Without further ado, over to you.
I'm really a bit surprised that can you hear? I better be careful, but this was going to be built around the essay from 1964 called The Art World. Since I had no idea that essay was at all widely known outside academic circles, and particularly American academic circles, because it's an essay that is widely anthologized, so that in the nature of things, if people take a course in aesthetics, they'd be familiar with it. I don't know how people get familiar with it over here, but I'm not going to try to summarize the paper, but presumably the configuration of the argument will emerge in the course of the discussion. My presentation, what I call the origins of the art world, that is to say the origins of that particular paper and why I wrote it, and what I thought about it, or what I think I thought about it, which is now really quite a long time ago. But the impetus for that essay, The Art World, came from seeing a painting by Roy Lichtenstein, which was reproduced in Art News in 1962. At that time, Art News was the defining American publication on what was happening in art. The title of the painting was The Kiss, and it showed what looked like a panel from an adventure comic strip like Terry and the Pirates, in which a pilot and a girl are kissing. I was living in France at that time, and I'd gone to the American Library on a trip to Paris to check out what was happening in the galleries back home. The shock of seeing that work in that venue was like reading that St. John the Divine, which is the Episcopal Cathedral in New York, had appointed a horse as a deacon. And I use that analogy deliberately to convey the sense of sacrilege that painting in that magazine created in my mind. What could they be thinking of? In 1959, the Museum of Modern Art had put on an exhibition called New Images of Man. The almost ecclesiastical invective with which that show was reviewed by the apostles of abstraction demonstrate that the New York art world at that time was deeply sectarian, like Europe in the 16th century. When MoMA thought there might still be some energy left in doing what artists called the figure, it had in mind Giacometti, Bacon, Leon Golub, and Jackson Pollock, who had, as you know, vehemently attacked de Kooning for his paintings of women shown in 1953 at the Janus Gallery. But nobody would have imagined pop as the new image of man. MoMA wanted to show that it was possible to do the figure and still be contemporary. But even when Kirk Varnedoe, the late director really of painting at the Museum of Modern Art, put comic strips in his high and low show in the 1980s, there was an uproar from the critical establishment in New York. But my feeling on seeing The Kiss was that everything was now possible, that the difference between abstraction and the figure was like the difference between the American and the National League in baseball. That is to say, the outcome was just something that didn't mean very much for very long. No one outside the extreme avant-garde of the 60s would have said that anything could be a work of art, which emerged as a position, I think, in the next decade with Beuys in particular. Fluxus made art out of ordinary objects, but then it drew a line. Only certain ordinary objects would have been considered a Fluxus object. There must have been considerable discussion of which objects were Fluxus and which weren't. What struck me when I began to follow pop on my return to New York was that artworks being shown consisted of things that in the traditional picture would have contrasted with art. There were in particular, what really got me excited, there were beds, which Plato used as his paradigm of a reality higher than artworks as a class. That is to say, in Book 10 of the Republic, there's the form of the bed, there's the actual bed that the carpenter makes, and then there are the beds that artists execute, for example, in showing Achilles and Priam and some kind of discussion on the side of a Grecian vase. Suddenly, you're beginning to see beds turning up in galleries by Rauschenberg or by George Siegel or even by de Kooning. That was a difference in ontology rather than what one might call genre. And I realized that a revolution of a philosophical order had taken place. The boundary between art and reality was again in philosophical receivership. That's what the paper, The Art World, was all about. I think the question was, one of the questions was, what was the impact of that essay on art history? That had to have been limited, since ontology is not, that art history is not a discipline greatly given, I think, to ontological speculation, which in the nature of the case has to take the form of a quest for what philosophers call necessary and sufficient conditions. At the same time, the impact on philosophy was considerable due to what I call a creative misreading of the ideas that the paper set forth by George Dickey, who founded the institutional theory of art. I found myself heralded as the founder of the institutional theory of art, according to which when and whether something is an artwork is a matter of an institution, specifically the art world decreeing as much. Now, the standard use of the expression art world does refer to a body of artists, dealers, critics, collectors, and the like, who really do make decisions about art, and maybe even decisions as to what objects are works of art. I, by contrast, use the term to refer to the world of artworks. It was almost like a community consisting of all and only the artworks. My sense was, at that time, that to be an artwork is to be part of that particular world, the members of which have certain rights, certain privileges, and my question was how something gets enfranchised to be an artwork. That's a political question. I just read a piece about a Belgian artist whose work consists at the moment in tattooed pigskins. He tattoos pigs, and when the pig dies, the skin gets bought by a museum. He says, in dying, I was able to give the pig a green card, and that's tantamount to a kind of enfranchisement as an artwork. He's transfigured from just a pig into an artwork. That's the kind of question I was concerned with. My sense being that to be an artwork is to be part of that world and, so to speak, have rights and privileges. And in 1964, the year The Art World was published, that saw, that year, the summer of freedom, as it was called, when concerned people went to the American South to help blacks claim their constitutional rights and privileges, that is to say, the rights and privileges to which they were constitutionally entitled. And I was struck by the fact that Andy Warhol's Brillo box was enfranchised as a work of art when the boxes it exactly resembled languished in the limbo of mere objects, though they resembled Warhol's boxes exactly, or let's say at least as closely as blacks resemble whites, which is in all relevant respects exactly. The relationship between the two Brillo boxes was, one was about the other. The relationship between Warhol's Brillo box and the other members of the world of artworks was more complex. They were, as curators like to say, in dialogue with one another. The Brillo box was cool, for example, while Jackson Pollock's She-Wolf was passionate. I developed the idea of a style matrix in the art world toward the end of that paper, in which all artworks could be fitted in terms of the absence or presence of such affinities or counter-affinities, if you like. At the time, my strategy was to argue that however much they resembled one another, the two Brillo boxes have disjoint causal histories. Warhol's box had a place in the history of art through being part of a movement, pop art, whose criteria they satisfied. He had established himself as a pop artist through his first show, which was in the windows of Bonwit Taylor, an upscale women's store on Fifth Avenue, for 2 weeks in April 1961, where Warhol displayed in large advertisements from pulp magazines, as well as certain comic strip panels. As we now know, the commercial Brillo box was designed by an artist, James Harvey, but that was not part of a movement. Actually, James Harvey was a second-generation abstract expressionist, and a very gifted one at that. The ordinary Brillo box had no location in the history of art. It was a kind of reality that pop art appropriated, but it itself was just a piece of everyday reality, something out of the Lebenswelt, as phenomenologists say. When I said in that paper, to see something as art, one had to know something about the recent theory and history of art, Warhol's box seemed to me enfranchised by the theory and the history of pop, which excluded Harvey's boxes except as subject matter. The theory of pop, again, was political. It insisted that the differences between high and vernacular art were entirely artificial. That's how Lichtenstein saw the matter, and with qualification, that's the way I think that the British theorists of pop, like Lawrence Alloway, who was my predecessor as art critic for The Nation magazine, saw the matter as well. That, in a way, opened a path for Harvey's box to come into the art world by the back door. That is to say, Alloway was really interested in commercial art, in popular music and popular literature, and he thought it was at least as complicated as high music, high literature, and so forth and so on. So I suppose by that criterion, Harvey's box would be, as a matter of fact, more complicated than might meet the eye. And I've tried to give a kind of art historical analysis of Harvey's box, which is in many ways much richer than Warhol's box, which is boring in a certain sense. I'd like to say, since this again was a question that was raised, that aesthetics had nothing to do with the enfranchisement of something as art. I think, aesthetically speaking, Harvey's Brillo box was fairly exciting, whereas Warhol's box was not. Anything that seems to be aesthetically distinctive of Warhol's box, he owes to Harvey's gifts as a package designer. 20 years later, in my book, The Transfiguration of the Commonplace, I was in position to advance a definition of artworks as what I called embodied meanings. I suppose an indirect contribution of the paper, The Art World, was to split the philosophy of art off from what had been the dreary subject of aesthetics. It was, if I may be allowed another political concept, a declaration of independence, that is to say, of the philosophy of art from aesthetics, a subject for which until quite recently I had no use. Years later, I tried to drain some of that dreariness away and even show how aesthetics can be assimilated to the issues of meaning that did interest me as a philosopher, but that's another story. Putting artworks outside life as objects of contemplation, disinterested contemplation, was like putting women on pedestals as ornaments, I thought. And I like to think that the pop revolution and the later feminist revolution were stages in the same struggle for emancipation, which was the history of the 1960s. How clear most of that was to me when I wrote the paper is difficult to say. I thought of it as a piece of analytical philosophy, somewhat iconoclastic, but most of my writing at the time was in a somewhat iconoclastic spirit. I spent a lot of time in the galleries, more than most philosophers, I think probably more than any philosopher at that time, I'm pretty sure. And Robert Morris's early show of minimalist boxes at the Green Gallery on 57th Street inflected my thinking, though not as much as Warhol's box did. I'd like to say that the better part of my mature life has been spent in cogitating on Warhol's Brillo box. What gets more and more clear to me is that the art world, the essay, was part of its time, part of a spiritual movement that embraced politics, religion, and Manhattan life. And I count myself blessed to have been alive in that dawn, to steal from Wordsworth, and open to forces I confess that I hardly understood. The upheaval of the 60s remains a mystery to me.
There's applause. Thank you, Arthur. It's my turn. Is this on? No. Yeah, is this on? Good. Thank you, Arthur. And thank you, Rebecca. Where is she? Oh, for inviting us. And also for informing the audience that the three of us spontaneously agreed to respect the pecking order of seniority.
That's right.
Which places me in the middle between Arthur and Richard. Arthur is 20 years older than me, and since each of his books on art states and restates that the initial impulse for his philosophizing about art came from having attended Andy Warhol's seminal 1964 show at the Stable Gallery in New York, where the Brillo boxes were first displayed, as he just told you, I thought it only fair to begin with an autobiographical statement myself. I was 19 when I first visited New York, and it was precisely in the summer of 1964. Though I didn't attend Warhol's show, which was in the spring, that's when I became brutally exposed to pop art for the first time. I was then a student at the Hochschule für Gestaltung in Ulm, Germany, wanting to become an industrial designer. And those of you who know the Hochschule also know what this entails. I was in the process of being thoroughly bred in or brainwashed by the post-Bauhaus ideology that art, or rather good design, the word art was taboo in Ulm, would make the world a better place to live in. With this in mind, you can realize how much pop art came as a shock to me. I had never encountered as radically non-utopian an art form before. I resisted, but I also vividly remember having thought at the time that if I had been an artist and if I had been American, that's what I would have done. Contrast this avowal to Arthur's candid admission, also rehearsed in several of his books, though not tonight, that he started out as a painter before he became a philosopher, and you will have some insight into our respective trajectories. I resisted to pop art for another 5 years or so, but by 1969 I was convinced that Warhol was among the greatest living artists. By then I had abandoned the idea of becoming a designer. I was a student in experimental psychology, and I was engaged in rather positivistic and preposterous endeavors to turn aesthetics into a verifiable science. It was only when I had in turn abandoned this fantasy and had become a young teacher of aesthetics, semiotics, and other art historical matters at a Brussels art school that I bumped into the work of Duchamp, and that his ready-mades became for me exactly the same kind of test case Warhol's Brillo boxes had been for Danto. This happened in 1975. Just figure yourself the young man I was at the time, and his background. Once upon a time I had dreamt of making the world a better place to live in by designing everyday objects, both functional and beautiful. Urinals were plausible candidates. We at the Ulm School had no contempt at all for such low body functions as urinating. Well-designed urinals might express the true art of our time, provided they were not called art. And now I had to deal with a man who, in perfect chiasmatic opposition to my original utopia, had seen to it that a plain urinal that was not the work of a designer would be called art, without claiming in the slightest to have made the world a better place to live in. Richard Schusterman would say, without any attempt at meliorism, his name for making the world a better place to live in, which is the purpose he assigns to art, culture, and aesthetic experience at large. So I find myself in this debate sitting in the middle of Arthur and Richard in more than one sense. Actually, I'm not sitting in the middle, but
Still no.
temporally.
You're virtually in the middle.
Yes, exactly. Temporally and conceptually, perhaps. For although I come from a tradition very different from American pragmatism, I cannot help but having the greatest sympathy for Richard Schusterman's normative enterprise. For him, popular culture is not unlike what industrial design was for me and my comrades from the Ulm School. Neither popular culture nor industrial art design would supplant high art or totally reverse existing hierarchies, but both were entitled to the same claims on aesthetic legitimacy as high art, minus one, its autonomy. When I bumped into Duchamp's ready-mades, perhaps as a belated after effect of my encounter with pop art in 1964, I found myself facing a challenge of a non-normative nature. To make sense of an aesthetically indifferent, if not illegitimate, object whose one and only claim was to proclaim the autonomy of art. It's the chiasmus again. For Duchamp's urinal was either art pure and simple, or else it was nothing. In Danto's words, a mere real thing. And the dividing line ran between two indiscernibles. What accounts for their difference? I had no idea in 1975 that in the wake of his bumping into Warhol's Brillo boxes, Arthur Danto had asked himself the same question in a piece entitled The Art World, which is now famous and which we were kindly asked to take as our starting point for today's discussion. I read it, if I remember, in 1979, as well as many other essays by Paul Ziff, William Koenig, Maurice Weitz, and others, all struggling with the same or similar questions from within the, to me, rather esoteric framework of analytic philosophy. So I had not read Danto at the time, but my initial response to the ready-mades was the same as his regarding the Brillo boxes, and I quote you in The Art World: "What in the end makes the difference between a Brillo box and a work of art consisting of a Brillo box is a certain theory of art." Like him, like you, Arthur, I saw it as my task to discover this theory. And almost like him, I formulated the problem in terms of the necessary and sufficient conditions for something, anything, to be called art. The emphasis on called is our slight difference. Unlike him, I approached the problem as a formalist art critic, not as a philosopher. Greenberg's lesson that modernist art was an inquiry into its own conditions of possibility, and that its history advanced by dumping conventions one by one as soon as they were discovered to be expendable, was not lost on me. My working hypothesis was that if Duchamp's ready-mades were art, they were self-referentially stating their own conditions of existence and had reduced them to the bare essentials. I was soon rewarded. 3 months later, I had a theory, drawn from Duchamp's work. 1. If any given thing was an object with material existence. 2. If an author could be ascribed to it. 3. If it found an audience. 4. If the first 3 conditions were framed by the adequate institutional context, then the thing in question could be art. It soon occurred to me that this theory would not have been required if Duchamp's work had not been called art already. Imagine the 20th century without Duchamp. To account for Picasso and all the rest, any good old theory of taste, or à la rigueur of aesthetic attitude, would do. What I had done with my Duchampian theory was behaving like an anthropologist from outer space who looked at the art world and considered that these people were ready to call art anything that satisfied the 4 conditions in question. I was the neutral observer of a sociological fact. By the same token, I had come dangerously close to an institutional theory of art, even though mine was not a theory of the performative power of calling something art, but rather an after-the-fact enunciative theory in Michel Foucault's sense. Given that something has been called art, let us look at what its conditions of enunciation were. And at that point, I realized something absolutely decisive, that I could not uphold this theory without personally endorsing Duchamp's ready-mades as art. I mean endorsing them explicitly, not merely taking them for granted. I was part of the art world and not an anthropologist from outer space, and it was my personal responsibility to baptize the thing myself. What was the nature of this responsibility? Epistemological? Yes. The theory is incoherent otherwise because it is unnecessary. Ethical? Definitely. And political too. As even George Dickey, the main proponent of the institutional theory of art, had to admit, I quote him, every person who sees himself as a member of the art world is thereby a member. For me, this was not so much a reality as it was a principle. I had to put my head on the block and run the risk of seeing my theory disenfranchised by those people who dismiss the ready-mades and the art done in their wake, Brillo boxes included, as mere hoaxes. It is then that I understood that my responsibility was aesthetic as well as epistemological and ethical. Aesthetic because at once epistemological and ethical. Aesthetic because bridging the gap between the epistemological and the ethical is what aesthetic judgments do. I was ripe for Kant, even though at the end of the 70s I was only confusedly aware of it. By 1982 I had come up with a new working hypothesis that I presented at a conference around Jean-François Lyotard in Cerisy, entitled Comment juger? It was extremely primitive and revolved around the idea that Duchamp's ready-mades had forced us to suppose that Kant's antinomy of taste had made way to an antinomy of art with quasi the same philosophical consequences. This became the core of Kant after Duchamp, written in the 80s and published 10 years ago. A book Arthur knows well, since he generously wrote what is familiarly called a blurb for its back cover. Thank you again, Arthur. Its main thesis is that when it comes to understanding what we do when we make aesthetic judgments and what is at stake in them, Kant basically got it right. But that in order to be updated, his critique of judgment ought to be reread after Duchamp, that is, mentally replacing the word beauty with the word art, and not implying that the meaning has been transferred from one name to the other, not at all, just mechanically replacing. Otherwise said, whereas in Kant's time the paradigmatic formula for an aesthetic judgment regarding works of art would have been this, as a piece of painting or sculpture or music, etc., is beautiful, it would now express itself by the naked sentence, this is art. In contrast to my Kant after Duchamp approach to aesthetics and art theory, Arthur Danto's might be termed the Hegel after Warhol approach. And Richard Schusterman, perhaps with less stringency, the Dewey after Stetsasonic approach. We each couple a philosopher with an artist or an art movement and update or reinterpret the philosopher with a view on the art. Ready-produced everyday objects, in my case, pop art and pop culture in the case of my colleagues. Our differences, and needless to say they are huge, come from our choice of the philosopher. We will come to that in the debate, I suppose. Richard still has to speak, so I won't anticipate. But there are more than enough similarities among our chosen objects to establish a common ground of concerns, uniting the three of us on this panel. Although, ironically enough, perhaps it will show in the debate that what unites us may turn out to be also what divides us, quite independently of our philosophical preferences. But let's also leave this for the debate. The one thing I enthusiastically share with both Arthur Danto's and Richard Schusterman's theories, though perhaps in a roundabout way, is their radical pluralism. Anything goes. Not that I think that this situation is the result of the philosophical task of art being accomplished, and not that I would endorse the fine art of rap music as being on the level of Mozart, but in the sense that I conceive of aesthetics, and I mean this very seriously, as a discipline that needs to be practiced from the point of view of the moron. By moron, I mean, for example, the member of the 1863 Salon jury who rejected Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe. We learn more by adopting his point of view than by taking the verdict of history for granted. By moron, I mean the layman who is not impressed by the snobism of the art world and dares say that he has seen the emperor's new clothes and that a box is just a box, a urinal just a urinal. By moron, I mean you and me, with respect to those things that our aesthetic judgments prove unable to assimilate. And since I don't want to insult you, by moron, I mean myself. When I pest at the rap music pouring from the blaster of the guy sitting in his four-wheel drive next to me at the red light, while my radio is turned on Mozart, or on Bob Dylan for that matter. It's not a question of high and low, it's a question of what hurts and what pleases my ears. And I can no more honestly say that I listen to rap than I can fancy myself in the black skin of a kid from the Bronx, for whom rap is full of meaning and deserves genuine connoisseurship. Pardon me, Richard, your defense of hip-hop really enlightened me. I found it convincing, well argued, and politically founded. But I can't help it. Aesthetic judgments are involuntary and impervious to rational argumentation. Just as I put my head on the block when resting my theory of art on the case of the ready-mades, so did you when you stated, page 201 of Pragmatic Aesthetics, quote, "Since I enjoy this music, I have a personal stake in defending its aesthetic legitimacy." This statement, to my eyes, legitimizes both the music you enjoy and your theory of art. It throws light on the aesthetic responsibility we take as theorists in personally endorsing our test cases. Arthur also put his head on the block when, page 37 of Beyond the Brillo box, he said regarding the boxes in question, quote, "I thought they were art," adding with true candor, "But I was in no sense part of the art world at that point. In blunter and unfair terms, I was the moron." Here, Arthur, is one of the very rare instances in your writings where you acknowledge that your theory of art, though not an aesthetic theory, hinges on your personal aesthetic judgment. I bet you will dispute this, and that's fine. We are here to articulate, not settle our differences. All the same, my sense of our common ground is that the three of us have put our heads on the block, inasmuch as we ran the risk of constructing theories of art verifiable or falsifiable by the moron, the layman, Mr. or Miss Anybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Rebecca for organizing this, and to both Arthur and Thierry for the inspiration of the talks that they've given. Arthur, I should also say, was generous in sharing with me and Thierry what he was going to say. So some of my remarks will pick up on Arthur's presentation, as this is also in some ways an event to celebrate and do honor to his work that has influenced, obviously, both me and Thierry. So one element that impresses me in Arthur's beautifully evocative recollection of the genesis and impact of his article, The Art World, is the religious rhetoric of his story. In the text he prepared for tonight, he speaks of sacrilege, apostles, theological invective, etc. Such theological tonality pervades his theory of the art world. From its inception in that article, where he argues, and I quote, but I'm not going to tell you the page, that the art world stands to the real world as the city of God stands to the earthly city, so that artworks are transfigured into a higher, sacred ontological realm, wholly different from mere real things, from which they may be visually or sensorially indiscernible. The religious rhetoric continues to percolate in his Transfiguration book, and still further into recent books, such as The Madonna of the Future and After the End of Art, where he affirms that art's role is to convey, and I quote, the kind of meaning that religion was capable of providing, end of quote. An idea that's similar to Hegel's idea of art belonging to the realm of absolute spirit, but with the twist that rather than religion superseding art, as in Hegel's story, art instead supersedes religion, as various aestheticists of the last fin de siècle have argued. When Arthur Danto's Art World article appeared, I was barely 14 years old, with no real concern for the world it theorized. At that time, I wouldn't have noticed or cared about the apparent sacrilege of Rauschenberg's bed, Warhol's boxes, or Lichtenstein's comic strip Kiss. Only this last might have captured my attention as a comic-reading teenager fascinated by the excitement of flight and sex. I first encountered Danto's article in the early 70s as an undergraduate in Jerusalem, and then more deeply while doing my doctorate at Oxford. I came to know Arthur not through the art world, but through the academic world of Anglo-American philosophical aesthetics, where his influence has been positively enormous, even if his views have sometimes been adapted in ways I find unfortunate. Let me briefly note just some of the ways he has enriched and reshaped this philosophical field. In Western modernity, philosophy of art has been essentially pursued under the notion of aesthetics, a term originally coined by Alexander Baumgarten to designate a much larger project of sensory knowledge, but which soon came to be identified with the study of art and beauty, which were regarded as essentially imaginative fictions and attractive appearances rather than the solid knowledge of ultimate reality and the principles of real action that form the stuff of other, more serious branches of philosophy. Anglo-American philosophy of art in my Oxford days of the late 70s was still dominated by this aesthetic orientation. Aesthetic appreciation, even in the understanding of art, was essentially a matter of surface appearance and immediacy of perceptual experience. This concentration on sensory data perfectly fit the dominant empiricism of British and American philosophy. My Oxford supervisor, J.O. Urmson, had influentially defined aesthetic focus, and I quote, as not even skin deep, as a matter of the way the object looks, end of quote. Monroe Beardsley, the then reigning dean of American aesthetics, defined art objects as mere complexes of qualities of surfaces. Meanwhile, Wittgenstein-inspired pluralists were emphasizing the obvious surface differences of the various media, genres, and individual works of art, and condemning the traditional philosophical urge to define art in terms of some deep universal essence as an urge that had made aesthetics so tediously vague, abstract, and dreary. Danto's art world jolted this dominant focus on the surface qualities and immediate experiences of art by showing that we could not even identify a work of art as such by relying simply on its immediately perceived properties of surface. For the same visual array would be perceived or experienced quite differently according to our interpretation of whether that array was an artwork or not and what that artwork was about. To see something as art, quoting Danto, requires something the eye cannot decry, an atmosphere of artistic theory, a knowledge of the history of art and art world, end of quote. That our immediate surface perceptions are essentially shaped by a background depth of specific practices, histories, and broader cultural forms of life was in fact a very Wittgensteinian insight that the Supro-Wittgensteinians failed to grasp. Just as Danto's crucial strategy of noting the differences between indiscernibles, like Warhol's boxes and ordinary Brillo boxes, was a key device that Wittgenstein deployed in different ways in his discussion of the duck-rabbit image and in his famous question in Philosophy of Action as to the difference between the visually identical appearances of willfully raising one's hand, say to ask a question, and of one's hand simply going up. In foregrounding the background of appearances, Arthur outwitted and out-Wittgensteined the aesthetic surface Wittgensteinians and paved the way for philosophy's institutional theories of art that defined an artwork as any artifact that an agent of the art world decrees as such. These theories located art's essence not in any perceptible qualities, but in the underlying social institution that granted art status, though they failed miserably to explain that institution with any of the sort of theoretical depth and breadth of empirical detail that makes Pierre Bourdieu's social theory of art so much more compelling. The genius of Danto is manifest in the way he skillfully links both surface and depth, liberating art from the limits of surface appearances, but respecting those appearances as both philosopher and as critic for their interpretive meaning and depth, without which they would not even appear as they do to those who can rightly see them. Just as the saint can recognize his surface stigmata as a divine mark of love rather than a mere blemish of the skin, or his Eucharist from a mere wafer. I return, you see, to the theological rhetoric that pervades Arthur's theory and suggests that art is somehow a substitute or analog of otherworldly religion. For him, there is an ineliminable gap between art and life, between its sanctified, transfigured objects and what he calls mere real things. An illimitable divide between the otherworldly sacredness of the artistic and the profanity of real life. This theological aura of Arthur's work has always enthralled me in a disturbing ambivalence of fascinated appreciation and distinct unease. I feel the pull of art's transcendent exaltation. But as a secular Israeli who has suffered from the intensities of religious fanaticism and the disrespect of real life that love of superior realities and cities of God so often aspire, I also worry that theologizing the art world, no matter how emancipatory the intention, has dangers. It obscures, for example, the this-worldly, sensuous, body-centered, fun-lovingly profane, and irreverently liberational energies that had been unleashed in the cultural world of the 60s and 70s, perhaps most paradigmatically in popular arts, that did not belong to the art world of which Arthur spoke in 1964, yet already had profoundly influenced it. For Arthur, Warhol's Brillo box is the surprising icon of art's transfiguration into otherworldliness, into art-worldliness. For me, a child of the 60s, though more of its music, sex, drugs, and mass media visual culture than its museums and gallery art, Warhol always had a more earthly message of bringing art and life closer together by showing the artistry in so-called ordinary objects, popular entertainments, and self-stylizing practices that were not seen as art in the art world sense. Viewing Warhol's art through his colorful, stylized art of living at the Factory and at Studio 54, I saw it as deflating the transcendental ideology of art shared by modernism and romanticism, while asserting that today's most vital and important art is not in the museum, but in the products, designs, and entertainments of everyday living. Campbell's Soup and Coca-Cola, Elvis and Marilyn, Superman and Dick Tracy. Real Brillo boxes, like blue jeans, which Warhol said he wished he had invented, making money is art, and working is art, and good business is the best art, Warhol said, I'm quoting him, proudly asserting that his art had gone into the stream of commerce out into the real world instead of confined in the art world. Pulling art down from its transcendental pedestal and into life may seem a cynically iconoclastic deflation, but it can also be positively construed as investing life itself with the enriched meaning, critical care, and intensity of experience that art, like religion, is associated with. For religious passion and beauty can be made manifest, as Zen recognizes, in the humblest of earthly objects and actions, untransfigured by the art world or by an otherworldly theology. With affectionate admiration, I happily defer to Arthur's superior knowledge of Warhol. But if Arthur is also right that, quoting him, the distinction between art and reality is absolute, end of quote, then philosophy of art seems essentially confined to the art world and has little to do with discerning and improving the opportunities of beauty and meaning in the real world. And if that is true, Arthur's enormously inspiring work has provided a powerful reason for defining myself not as a philosopher of art, but as an aesthetic philosopher, one whose interests extend beyond the sacralized arts to the popular arts and the arts of living. Thank you.
I think I should say a few words about both of the papers, and then we can then go on.
That's right.
From there.
We're moderating ourselves.
Yeah, self-moderating. I certainly have used an awful lot of religious language, though I'm about as far from a religious person as I suppose you could find, at least as secular as you, Richard. But I feel nevertheless drawn to the conceptual questions that are raised by a religion that's certainly not mine, Christianity. And I don't know whether these problems even would exist if it hadn't been for this incredible conception that Christianity put forward, that God has got to be like a human. In fact, has to be a human, has actually to be brought into the world by a human mother, actually has to bleed. For example, I mean, the paintings of the circumcision, where the first blood that's drawn, are terribly important for Christianity because you're establishing the humanity of Jesus that he bleeds. And I suppose to carry the Christian concept a little bit further, really has to suffer. For whatever reason, suffering is connected with wiping us clean of original sin, actually has to suffer, and as a human being would suffer. And I think to myself that the problem of art and reality is a lot like the problem of Jesus and somebody who looks just like Jesus. That is to say, yeah, but this one happens to be a god, and so forth. And the humanity is easy enough to show. It bleeds or it suffers. But how do you show the divinity? That's not so easy. And this is the Warhol problem exactly. You know, you can, the reality we can handle. I mean, you can put things in it and so forth and so on. You can break it, but where does the art come from? That has to be invisible, and in a certain sense, a matter of faith. You might say, and I don't know any tradition in which that question could have arisen for art as it has in the Christian West, because that, after all, those are the parameters in which we work, and why, I suppose, although this is another question entirely, why art has, in consequence, to be such an exalted kind of thing. I think that what makes Warhol such a fascinating figure is it's exalted because it's art, but there's no difference between it and let's say the ordinary Brillo box. Although I always have to say that the Brillo box a little bit hijacked the whole question in that show at the Stable Gallery, there were 6 cartons, as a matter of fact. There was Kellogg's Corn Flakes, there was Del Monte Peach Halves, there was Heinz ketchup, I think. There was Campbell's soup. There were 6 different boxes, and all of them raised the same question that the Brillo box raised. They were all raising the same question, but nobody talked about any of the rest of them because the Brillo box happened to be a superior piece of design, and that's what James Harvey gets all the credit for, the brilliant visual rhetoric with which he celebrates Brillo in that kind of thing. So for me, the religious language just comes inevitably in discussing that. Although I did get a little bit in hot water on the first page of the Transfiguration. I used the actual language of the biblical language of the Transfiguration. Of Christ shows himself white and glistering, and then I talk about like the urinal and so forth. And the woman who read it said, "I will not have my Savior compared to a toilet." But that was impudence on my part. But I was taking these questions so naturally and as a matter of course. And I'd like to just say just one word to Cherry about his idea that if it's not just pure art, it's nothing. And I think that it's charged. The urinal is charged. It's not just pure art. It's there because of the challenge that it mounts. It comes out of a tradition just as Warhol does. Warhol comes out of pop art. Duchamp comes out of Dada. And Dada was out really to attack the values of the swine that caused World War I, and where millions and millions of wonderful people were killed and so forth. They said, and why should we make beauty? Why should we make beauty for a ruling class like that? We're going to make art that's not beautiful or anti-beautiful in a certain way. My paradigm for that is the Mona Lisa with a mustache, where he desecrates this emblem, this exalted object, by drawing a mustache on it. But I think the urinal does the same kind of thing. The criterion for him, it's true that his language, when he talks about the ready-made, is that should have no aesthetic distinction one way or another. But I think that narrows the notion of aesthetic. It has an aesthetic. Sure. And it's just not the aesthetic of beauty as his patron thought it was. It was a very different kind of an aesthetic.
But that doesn't make it into art.
Yeah. So I just feel it was that. But, and this is the last point in response to your question. When I say it was art, when I first saw it, for me it was art, though I was in no sense part of the art world at that point. I saw it from the perspective of a philosophical question. I saw that here are two things that are exactly alike but momentously different, because one is art and one is not.
How did you know?
And I was...
How did you know it was art?
Because that's where it was. It was in an art gallery. I knew it was art. So the question was, here's something else. No, wait, let me finish.
Institutional theory is right.
No, let me finish this off, because it shows where I was coming from. I mean, I was a person who was trained in epistemology and in the philosophy of Descartes, and here's reality and here's dream, and there's no difference between them. Phenomenologically, no difference between them. And yet the differences are supposed to be momentous. So thinking in those terms, from the perspective of somebody who's obsessed with the questions of skepticism, as were raised by figures like this, well, from Sextus Empiricus, but specifically Descartes, I thought if there are two things that are exactly like but momentously different, and this is art, then, and this is real, then where do we go from there? So it was art only in the sense of a framework for a question of epistemology, practically. And so I took it for granted. Yeah, okay. I just wanted to deliver
sure,
that.
But that's that would be a great misunderstanding if we continued to rehearse our respective positions based on that, because we're talking about two different things. You're talking, when you say the urinal is not nothing because it has certain aesthetic qualities or anti-qualities, and it was laden with all sorts of things, Dadaism included. I'm not talking about this. It's either you judge that this thing is art or you don't. If you don't, then it is not. So your two indiscernibles are two identical objects, one of which is art and one of which is not. My indiscernibles is the same object twice.
I see.
Once to judge it art and once to judge that it is not art. It's a totally different question. The issue, so that when you say that in the end what makes the difference between a Warhol Brillo box and a Harvey's Brillo box is a certain theory, and you say, your sentence said, well, that is what makes the difference.
Yeah.
I will go along with you to say that perhaps the theory, the kind of theory that I myself concocted in the 70s, right? That the theory will account for the difference, perhaps.
Yes.
But the theory is not what makes the difference.
No.
It's the judgment that makes the difference. So I'm coming back to you with a question: how do you know that this thing is art? Unless you accept the institutional theory of art by saying, yes, it was in an art gallery.
Let me recreate the experience.
Sure.
Because you came a little too late to have had it.
Exactly.
And so,
I grant you that.
let me describe.
I took the precaution of putting that on paper because I knew it was going to come.
Let me describe the Stable Gallery in 1964.
Sure.
It was in one of those classy East Side white stone townhouses. It was very classy. That's high market real estate. And when you walk into that building, you black and white tile. There's a staircase that goes up of an elegant sort, and you can still see it today because what was that building? I mean, that building has since been incorporated as the side entrance of the Whitney Museum. That's the employee entrance on 74th Street, just off Madison Avenue. Now, imagine going into that building and you turn left and you walk into what's supposed to be an art gallery, and it's piled up with these boxes. It was like a surrealistic experience. It was like something, if you remember that film Dreams That Money Can Buy by Hans Richter, it was like entering Wonderland in a certain sense because it was so incongruent with the rest of the building. It was a very powerful experience. So it wasn't just an object. It was an object in a context, the context of the Stable Gallery. Eleanor Ward, who was the dealer, the gallerist, as they say today, she felt, Richard, it was a desecration. It was a desecration, that they were mocking her by doing that. But the shot was very powerful. It was difficult to see it as anything but art for that reason, it seems to me. It was an intense experience in a way in which if you just saw the box alone, I think, you probably wouldn't have felt that has to be art. So you have to give the institutional theory that much credit, even though, as you say, Richard, the contribution that I was making was that it has nothing to do with surface quality. But these were not surface qualities. These were qualities derivative from its placement.
One thing. Now, it's interesting because you moved from the institutional theory and you told us it was a very powerful experience.
Yeah.
Wasn't that an aesthetic experience?
What?
Wasn't that an aesthetic
Of course it was
experience?
an aesthetic experience.
So when I say that you hinge your theory on your initial aesthetic judgment, I'm right.
Yeah, it was aesthetic for sure, but to begin with, as I say,
But it was interpretive. I think this is, if I can speak in
Sure.
some way,
Okay.
you know, for you, although I also speak against you. I think Arthur's understanding of that as art was immediately perceptual. He didn't
Yeah.
need to look at the catalog. He saw it as art because he had digested so many theories of art, where one of the ways of being art in one of the matrices is to shock. And you know, this was after Duchamp, after Dada, so he could immediately experience the shock value, and interpret that as art without what, at least in the Anglo-American field, we thought of aesthetic experience in terms of beauty and consummation and harmony and building up. So there was an art world mediated immediate interpretation without needing to rely on a positive experience, you know, the kind that in your work, and Thierry, I mean, what's interesting, I find, in your work is that there's a feeling, but it's not necessarily a clearly defined, formalistic sort of feeling. But
It can be any feeling,
that's
so
right.
that negative feelings are entitled to be
that's right.
feelings as well.
And so I think in Arthur can have his version of the art world where it's immediately perceived through his mediation. I mean, again, this is why Bourdieu's work is so much superior to George Dickey's, because he explains how the institution educates the perceivers,
Yes.
so that the perceivers don't need the institution in an immediate way, because they've already been trained to see the way the institution structures the perception. Again, with the religious analogy, in the same way that a religious person immediately sees the religious meaning without having to say, oh, I'm in a church, oh, I remember in catechism, such and such really is the host. And so, and also without that reaction. You know, to come back again to the religious issue, and you know, it's again a question, because I don't know if it's not as famous as the Art World essay, but Arthur wrote a very lovely essay called Upper West Side Buddhism, where he talks about the influence of Zen as mediated by Suzuki, who spent some time in Colombia and had probably an important influence in the art world through Cage and Merce Cunningham. You know, the question is, can we understand art without the Platonic Christian ontology? If we want to say that there's art in China and there's art in Japan, very fine and developed art, without that difference between the real world and some sacralized transcendental realm where art is different from ordinary life, but different in the sense that it's more special, it's invested more with meaning. And this goes back to Thierry and the sort of Bauhaus kind of ideology. I mean, is that possible? Can there be art without the ontological leap?
Well, I think one of the things that I think New York was ready for was the Brillo box. It has to be ready for it, but I didn't appreciate it at the time because it was only later that I began to realize the deep penetration into artistic culture of Suzuki's ideas. I mean, everybody came, and it was the Duchamp Suzuki conception that there doesn't have to be anything remarkable about an object to be an artwork. I mean, and that was just as there doesn't have to be anything remarkable about it to be a religious object. That was the teaching. That was the teaching of Zen. And in the art world, the paper, I used a passage from a Chinese writer that I learned from Dr. Suzuki, where in Qin Yuan said, when I was young, I saw mountains as mountains and waters as waters. And then when I became philosophically sophisticated, I realized that mountains weren't really mountains and that waters weren't really waters. But now that I've found Zen, I realize once again that mountains are mountains and waters are waters. And I imagine 3 landscapes by Qin Yuan, 3 stages, and they all look alike. Mountains and waters, mountains and waters, mountains and waters. But this is a Zen painting, and this is just an ordinary landscape, and this is what? This is the Veil of Maya or something like that. Something
but they wouldn't look all alike to him.
Well,
that's right.
Who knows?
They wouldn't look all alike to him.
But that was the idea that I think Suzuki presented to people.
Yeah, I think
Dustin was
this beautiful Zen story is this beautiful Zen story that you just told us actually illustrates perfectly what I mean by practicing aesthetics from the point of view of the moron, because the man in position 3 is back to position 1. Position 3 is indiscernible from position 1.
That's right.
Exactly. But now we're not talking about indiscernibility of 2 objects anymore, but of 2 experiences, of 2 life experiences, of 2 philosophies, and so on. And that is the point. It's the subjectivity that I'm interested in, and of course I grant you all the rest. But it's especially so that it just I think throws light without saying that anyone is better than the other, but they have philosophical consequences that are totally different from looking at the indiscernibility problem from the... So the moron, of course the aesthetician or the art theorist is supposed to be more or less enlightened, I suppose, but inasmuch as he adopts the point of view of the moron, he is like your Zen man in position 3 and 1 at the same time. That is, I deeply respect the opinion of the guy who says, fuck you, this is just a bloody box, or this is just a bloody urinal, and I'm not going to let myself be intimidated by these people of the art world. So my sense of democracy, we're all 3 Democrats here on this panel, I think, profoundly Democrats.
Yeah.
But we justify our democracy differently. That is how I would justify mine.
And I guess I would say, and then I think we should allow, I think we've got around 9-10 minutes left, some time for questions, because that really would be democratic.
Really, we have hardly
I would say that that third stage is, if you want to keep the moron, an enlightened moron. Yeah. And the enlightened moron really does see differently. He would say, yes, those are Brillo boxes, but the meaning of Brillo boxes for him would be altogether different. And that difference is, as you show very well in your work, is an experiential one and not something that's imposed by an art world institution. So I don't know how we're going to deal with questions, but I think we should open the floor for around 8 minutes of them. And Rebecca, do you want to, the person with the mic has the authority here.
I think in a way the Zen story is perhaps in a way which is incorrect. The first story, the object and subject.
Speak into the mic, please.
In the first story, the object and the subject are distinct. So you have the mountain and the subject who perceives the mountain. In the second story, there's confusion as to what is subject and object. I don't know the difference anymore. In the third story, he sees the mountains as mountains because they become mountains. So in other words, the subject and object united together. So there's a changing condition. And so it's that there's an ontological shift.
I think what's important, what the important presupposition is that as far as experience is concerned, they're all alike. They really have to look alike, or it wouldn't really be the kind of parable that I take it to be. They're all alike, but deeply, deeply different. One is what philosophers would have called naive realism. The second one would have been somebody who sees the world as a naive realist, but realizes that that's a curse. If only I could escape from this world of Maya and into the realm of being. And then the third one is, well, the Zen picture. But the differences are momentous but invisible. A conjunction that I like to employ, and I think that they really live in different worlds, though the worlds are exactly the same. It would be kind of disillusioning if somebody said, "Well, I'm going to go to heaven," and you go to heaven and it winds up looking like 42nd Street. You say, "Well, I mean that's how it is." The differences are invisible, but you really earned your right to be here, or something. I don't know, just the homiletician would solve that.
Sorry, I hate these things. I don't know if you can hear me. I just wondered if you could, talking about reality mimicking the real and
I can't hear, I'm sorry.
Can you hear me? Sorry. I was going to ask the question about contemporary photography and the way that maybe it mimics documentary photography. Today we see both documentary and fine art photography in the same context, in the institutional context of the museum. And for myself, I find it very difficult to know what I'm looking at sometimes. I don't know whether to judge it with an aesthetic judgment. I don't know whether the intention of the photographer who's trying to deconstruct the documentary or construct reality. But there seems to be a similarity with the ready-made.
Yes.
The documentary photography and today's realm of photography, which is mimicking documentary but with very, very different intentions. And I wonder if it's something that you've thought about.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've got the question, or it's an observation more than a question, but I do think that the history of photography, that there's been a kind of dialectic between photography and art. I mean, was it art? Was photography art, or wasn't it? Stieglitz, who was hospitable to Duchamp, he's the one who photographed Fountain. If it weren't for Stieglitz, we basically wouldn't know what it looked like. He admired Duchamp because he was challenging the authorities on art who wouldn't consider photography art. So he felt that he and Duchamp were actually on the same side there. But there was that dialectic, and I think with Stieglitz, his photography did make an effort to be arty in some kind of way, and the Steichen and the people in the photo secession in New York at that time were very involved in making artistic photographs in some way. And then you get a revolution where you say it doesn't have to be like that. A photograph, you can begin to cherish a photograph just for its photographic qualities and begin to take from vernacular photography everything that you need, as for example in Cindy Sherman's great work, that you wouldn't know the difference between what she did and an ordinary still. She told me that she used to find these stills in thrift shops in downtown New York where she bought her clothes. There were these bins of old stills, and she would look at them and try and figure out what the movie would have been about, what the story would have been about. They were about, she said they were 25 cents each, and she would buy these things. But that was vernacular photography, which she then turned into art without necessarily doing anything that would make them look like anything except stills. So I think that there are those parallels.
One link, just one little thing. There's one other link between the ready-made and the photograph, is that every photograph is a ready-made drawing or a ready-made painting. Among the origins of the ready-made in Duchamp's mind, I think we ought to take that into account. That he as a painter felt like everybody else in the 19th century threatened by the existence of photography, that is a machine that would do his job. But of course, with his sense of irony, he turned the threat into an advantage. And part of the subtext of the ready-made is that it's about photography. It's a sort of, it is, because not because ready-mades are photographs, but on the contrary, because photographs are ready-mades.
I have a question for the panel. A lot of the talk was around faith and the language of faith, be it Christian or otherwise. And the question really was that our visual culture today, after sort of decades of steering away from issues of faith, seems to be putting up with them, whether it be films, as in the Mel Gibson book, or comic strips, as in the kerfuffle over the Danish cartoon, or what we call high art, going back to faith, whether it's Tom Hunter or others. What part does the aesthetic judgment have to play now when it looks at these sort of visual culture dealing with faith?
Richard? I'm willing to...
Yeah. Well, one of the arguments for the view that there is still some sort of autonomy or sense of autonomy of art is the fact that all sorts of things that would be censored for all kinds of reasons looks to the aesthetic as a device to save them. If we look historically, I'm a big believer in bringing art into life, although I'm very aware of the dangers. When I wrote about rap music, it was before Ice-T did Cop Killer and the Gangster album. And so in the days of Grandmaster Flash, rap was both more musically interesting and also more politically progressive. But in the long history of art, the aesthetic had a purpose of allowing all kinds of subjects that were critical of faith to actually get a purchase. It allowed people to paint naked women by putting them in a mythological Greek context at a time when it would have been sacrilege to do nudes of women if they weren't made remote in the form of Venus or some Greek heroine or nymph. So I think the role of the aesthetic has been to allow expression of things that faith dogma would not allow. One of the interesting questions is whether there is room for aesthetic censorship. In other words, censoring artwork because it's aesthetically bad rather than politically bad. There are cases of that even in this country. I think Ruskin destroyed a lot of drawings that he thought were aesthetically inferior. So I am addressing your question, but I know I'm not satisfying you in terms of I'm not going to make a statement. I haven't looked at those cartoons that were published in Copenhagen, but I think I know that there's some big storm in France because Le Monde published them.
No, it's François.
François, okay.
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of things that are more important than art and aesthetics. So I don't want to say that aesthetics gives a carte blanche for all sorts of hate speech. And but what I do think the aesthetic has done, and art has done positively, is that it has allowed a space for all sorts of ideas to be expressed that historically couldn't have been expressed. So in terms of my view of things, I justify historically a kind of cloisonnement or separation of art from real life. But what I think we need to do now is to bring it back into real life. And I think there's no way of avoiding aesthetic uses of art in politics. And so it would be naive for philosophers of aesthetics, which I think includes philosophy of art, to just say, well, art is its own autonomous domain, and it should be kept out of the political issues. I think we're all agreed that there is tremendous political power to art, and art is also inevitably influenced by politics.
I want to address the issue perhaps also, but the issue of faith itself as a philosophical problem is unfathomable, probably. Since the philosopher that I chose to be the one who accompanies me in my endeavors is Kant, I am totally convinced that that there is a sort that faith is there is. How should I say? That may be Kant's definition of an aesthetic judgment, may be the first totally secularized definition of faith. I'm serious, but I'm not going to argue. I'm not going to argue. This is something, faith as opposed to belief. The only thing I want you to understand at this point, it's absolutely necessary. Faith is an act, belief is a state. And I believe in this, that is, belief is for me superstition. Faith requires an act of faith. And an act of faith is by definition a declaration of faith. That is, you make your faith public. And in that sense, it is something like an act of, like a test, how should I say, testimony of confidence in the other. To have faith is to have confidence, right? And you cannot have confidence in yourself. You have to it's also addressed to the other. So that's enough for the basic thing. That is why the religious issue is so complicated that we cannot look at it from simply what is coming back at us and the return of the religious that is surrounding us everywhere, for which most of us, I don't know, but at least the three of us on the panel, I'm sure, are rather afraid of. Okay? So that's one thing I want to say. It's on the what my convictions regarding philosophy are concerned. The second thing is historical. We have how old is art? At least as old as humanity, or at least as old as the minute people began to bury their dead. At that point, you have the first manifestations of art. That's at least 40,000 years old. So you draw a line 40,000 millimeters, let's say, and modernity is the last 200 years. That's 2 millimeters. That's nothing. That's nothing. So for all that duration, art and religion were together. High art was religious art. Even when it's ornamental art, abstract art, in some cultures, it was laden with symbols, and therefore it had this spiritual thing. And then we killed God like 200 years ago with the French Revolution, and Nietzsche saying God is dead. So we don't have the distance to imagine at this point whether the thing that we have been calling art for that long will survive the death of God. I don't know. I really don't know. What I am convinced of is that modernity is a struggle with that deep question. And whether God will come back and people of the future will return to religion, I do not know either. At this point, the signs go in all directions. So that's all I wanted to say to address that issue. But I want to add one more thing, which gets us back to the Brillo box. And you remember, no, but this is so funny. It's because now I said something very serious. I want to say something very funny. Do you remember, Arthur, when we were at this Bielefeld conference around you and your work? You remember that when Carl Ludeking, our common friend, invited you with a number of people around. And then Boris Groys said something fantastic there, that Christ had done his second coming in the shape of a Brillo box.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think
he knocked us out.
Now he knocked us out, and I think there is some deep truth in there, all faith and religious beliefs set aside. And that has to do indeed with the theory of the image, that I am convinced that I'm not going to talk about that, but just two things, because at this conference many important things happened. One of them was that, and one of them was Martin Zale finally yielding after having resisted to you for a number of... and finally saying, well, perhaps you've got it right. There is an essence of art. You put your finger on the ontological definition of art when you say it's embodied aboutness, right? You remember that? But embodied aboutness is, and here, if I may, I have to scratch my memory. Richard, you quote, I didn't know that quote, but it's very interesting with regard to this debate. You quote Richard Rorty as saying that humans are nothing but incarnated vocabularies.
That's right.
You remember? So between incarnated vocabularies, the way Rorty defines that, human beings, he said, and embodied aboutness regarding the object that you're calling. So which the similarity is enormous. In one case you define people, and in the other you define objects. So that your indiscernibles being objects, my indiscernibles being the subjective judgment of people, somehow we are talking about the same thing, even though we are not talking about the same thing.
Well, that's a standard situation, right?
Yeah. And But in the end, what I think your work is deeply involved with, and that is what touches me, moves me, interests me also the most, is that you are talking about the human condition all the time.
Yeah. Well,
that's what you're talking about. You're not talking about Brillo boxes and of course I am persuaded that art also talks about the human condition deeply, at a deep level. So we will
have that in common.
That's right.
We will agree with that. And you are obsessed with this idea of embodied meanings. And it's to me, these are extremely interesting questions that you approach not only in works in relation with the works of art, but also elsewhere in your writings. And I'm thinking in an exemplary fashion of that book called The Body-Body Problem, where it is. So where you finally, everything put to rest, it's not the body-mind problem that's the problem, it's the body-body problem. Given that we are incarnated thoughts.
That's right.
Let us leave all these, neurosciences debate for the specialists, but we are incarnated thoughts, and it's the difference between the body and the body. But I'll let you talk about that subject I talked about. So we went from religion, in fact, to secular humanism, shall we say?
And the question is, how divine is that, and what sort of divinity?
I don't give a shit about divine at all. I mean,
well, that's because that's really the basic issue about having a sense of humanity that is deep and important without having to make it hang from some transcendental realm. in a whole other ontological...
Please don't use the word transcendental.
Well,
no, but
I'm not the one who introduces the religious Christian vocabulary.
No, but let's just make sure that the audience understands that Kant's transcendental is not Walt Whitman's transcendental.
Yeah, I know.
That's all I want to be sure. It's transcendental for Kant means it's an idea.
Yeah.
I cannot prove it. It's just an idea. So we use the word transcendental differently.
No, of course, and I wasn't talking about Kant. I was talking about
some kind of religion.
Christianity. I was talking about transcendental, in the layman's terms.
Transcendent would be the term.
So I think, yeah.
I think on the term transcendental, it's most probably, I was going to say redemptive. I think we've heard about the aesthetic judgment as, well actually we've heard about the aesthetic as redemptive, political, institutional. I certainly believe in the redemptive qualities of alcohol, of which we have lots outside. So before I ask us to pursue the conversation elsewhere, my really profound thanks to Richard Schusterman, Arthur Danto and Thierry Dudoup. I think we've been incredibly privileged tonight to have all three on the same platform. And finally, we're having a very serious discussion about aesthetics, and I see many other things coming up in our programme now inspired by this. I hope you've enjoyed it certainly as much as I have, and I'm sure the people to whom we're webcasting to will have done as well. So I hope you join in my thanks to the three of them. Thank you very much, and to Naked Punch.